In 1962, 17 coal miners descended into the depths of the Blackwater Mine in Matewan, West Virginia, for their morning shift. None of them ever came back up. The official report blamed a catastrophic methane explosion that collapsed 3 tunnels, sealing the miners inside. The company paid settlements to the families, the mine was permanently closed, and Matewan moved on from its tragedy. But 50 years later, when the county sheriff was reviewing old archives, he found something that contradicted everything the town had been told: a sealed room deep underground that had never been touched by any explosion. What he discovered inside would force him to reopen a case that powerful people had spent 50 years trying to bury, and prove that sometimes the deadliest secrets are the ones closest to home. Sheriff Danny Morrison had been putting off cleaning out the old file room for 3 years, but the new computer system meant all the paper records had to be sorted, scanned, or thrown away. It was tedious work that he'd been doing in chunks after his regular shifts when the county building was quiet and he could think. The basement storage room smelled like dust and old paper, with boxes stacked floor to ceiling dating back to the 1940s. Most of it was routine stuff: property disputes, minor arrests, budget reports that nobody would ever need again. But Danny was methodical by nature, the kind of cop who read every page before deciding what to keep. That's how he found the file marked Blackwater Mine Incident, 1962. The folder was thick, wedged between a stack of old traffic citations and a box of courthouse maintenance records. Danny had heard the story growing up: 17 miners killed in an explosion, the worst tragedy in Matewan's history. His own grandfather used to work the mines before switching to construction, always said it was dangerous work, but good pay for a man with limited options. Danny pulled the file out and set it on the old wooden table he'd been using as a workspace. The incident report was yellowed with age, typed on an old typewriter with letters that had seen better days. The header read Mingo County Sheriff's Department with the date stamped below. April 23, 1962. Location: Blackwater Mine, Route 52, Matewan, West Virginia. Incident type: industrial accident, multiple fatalities. According to the report, at approximately 11:47 a.m., a methane gas explosion had occurred in the eastern section of the mine. 17 miners were underground when it happened. All were presumed dead due to tunnel collapse and rescue teams being unable to reach the affected areas. Then came the list that made Danny's blood run cold. 17 names, 17 men who never made it home that day, 17 families destroyed in a single morning. But one name on that list made him stop reading entirely. Morrison James Patrick, age 31, lead foreman. Morrison. His grandfather's name had been James Patrick Morrison. Danny felt something cold settle in his stomach. His grandfather had died when Danny was 12, but he'd always been told it was a heart attack. The family never talked about him working in the mines. Danny's father had always said his grandfather worked construction, built houses, stayed away from the dangerous underground work. But here was his grandfather's name, listed as the lead foreman of the crew that died in the Blackwater Mine explosion. Danny flipped through the rest of the file, looking for more details. There were photographs, black and white images of the mine entrance, rescue equipment, officials in suits talking to reporters. But what caught his attention was a handwritten note clipped to the back of the incident report. Investigation incomplete. Recommend further inquiry into company safety protocols and timeline of events. Several discrepancies noted in witness statements. Deputy R. Collins. Below that, in different handwriting, case closed by order of Sheriff Hawkins. No further investigation required. Danny stared at the note. Someone had wanted to investigate further, but had been told to stop. Why would a sheriff shut down an investigation into 17 deaths? He kept reading. The next document was a settlement agreement between Cumberland Coal Company and the families of the victims. Each family received $5,000, a significant amount in 1962, but not enough to compensate for losing a husband and father. What was strange was how quickly everything had been settled. The explosion happened on April 23rd. By May 15th, less than 3 weeks later, all the families had signed settlement agreements and the mine had been permanently sealed. Danny had investigated enough industrial accidents to know they usually took months or years to resolve, especially ones involving multiple fatalities. Companies fought payouts, insurance companies demanded extensive investigations, families hired lawyers and filed lawsuits. But the Blackwater Mine case had been wrapped up in less than a month. At the bottom of the file was a manila envelope marked Evidence, Property of Cumberland Coal Company. Inside were what looked like geological survey reports, pages covered with technical diagrams and mineral composition analyses that Danny couldn't understand. But one phrase kept appearing throughout the surveys. High-grade uranium ore deposits, estimated value $2.3 million per ton. Danny sat back in his chair, the pieces clicking together in his mind. In 1962, uranium was incredibly valuable. The Cold War was at its peak, nuclear weapons were being built as fast as possible, and uranium deposits were strategic resources. If the Blackwater Mine had contained uranium worth millions of dollars per ton, that changed everything about the explosion. It wasn't just an industrial accident, it was potentially a cover-up to hide valuable mineral deposits. Danny's radio crackled to life, making him jump. "Sheriff Morrison, you copy?" He keyed the mic. "Go ahead. Dispatch?" "Got a call from the State Mining Inspector's office. They want to schedule a meeting about some old mine safety records they need for a federal audit. Should I set something up?" Danny looked down at the file spread across the table, at his grandfather's name on the victim list, at the uranium surveys that had never been made public. "Tell them I'll call them back," he said. "I need to look into something first." As he hung up the radio, Danny made a decision. He was going to drive out to the old Blackwater Mine site and see what remained of the place where his grandfather had supposedly died 50 years ago. Because something about this file didn't add up. And if there was one thing Danny had learned in 15 years of police work, it was that when official stories moved too fast and settled too easily, there were usually secrets worth uncovering. He gathered up the files, locked them in his truck, and headed out onto Route 52. The Blackwater Mine was only 20 minutes from town, but Danny had never been there, never had a reason to visit the site of a 50-year-old tragedy. But as he drove through the winding mountain roads, Danny couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to discover his grandfather hadn't died the way his family had always believed. And if he was right about that, then maybe 17 other families had been lied to as well. The question was, who had lied to them and what had they been trying to hide? The road to the Blackwater Mine had been abandoned almost as long as the mine itself. Danny's patrol car bounced over potholes and cracked asphalt that nature was slowly reclaiming, weeds growing through the gaps like green fingers trying to erase the past. The entrance gate hung open on rusted hinges, a faded sign still visible. Cumberland Coal Company, authorized personnel only. Below it, someone had spray-painted, "Danger! Keep out," in red letters that had bled down the metal like dried blood. Danny parked beside the gate and stepped out into the mountain silence. The air smelled of pine trees and old coal dust, with an underlying dampness that seemed to seep up from the earth itself. 50 years of weather had softened the industrial scars, but the bones of the operation were still visible. Concrete foundations where buildings had stood, rusted rail tracks that once carried coal cars, and in the distance, the dark mouth of the mine shaft sealed behind a wall of concrete and steel. He walked up the gravel road, his boots crunching on stones mixed with coal fragments that still littered the ground. The deeper he went into the site, the more wrong everything felt. Danny had seen other abandoned mines during his time as sheriff, places that had been shut down due to declining coal prices or environmental regulations. Those sites looked like what they were, industrial operations that had simply stopped working. Equipment left where it fell, buildings stripped of valuable materials, gradual decay setting in over years or decades. But the Blackwater Mine looked different. It looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. Near what had once been the main office building, Danny found scattered papers half buried under decades of leaves. Most were too damaged to read, but he could make out fragments, timesheets, safety reports, personnel records. The kind of paperwork that companies usually secured or destroyed when closing down operations. More concerning was what he found near the sealed mine entrance, concrete blocks and steel reinforcement that looked far more extensive than necessary for a simple closure. This wasn't just sealing a dangerous mine shaft. This looked like someone had been determined to make sure nothing could ever get in or out. Danny walked around the perimeter of the seal, studying the construction. The concrete was poured thick, with steel beams welded across the opening in a crosshatch pattern. But what caught his attention were the dates stamped into the concrete at ground level: April 24, 1962, and April 25, 1962. April 24th and 25th, 1962, the day after the reported explosion, and the day after that. Danny frowned. According to the file he'd read, rescue operations had continued for several days after the explosion as teams tried to reach the trapped miners. But if they'd started sealing the mine entrance less than 24 hours after the incident, how could there have been any rescue attempts? He pulled out his phone and took photos of the concrete dates, the heavy steel reinforcement, the scattered paperwork. Then he walked back toward his patrol car, making a mental list of the questions that were piling up. Why had the mine been sealed so quickly? Why had the sheriff's department been ordered to stop investigating? Why had his family never told him his grandfather died in the mine explosion? And most importantly, what had been so valuable about this particular mine that someone was willing to kill 17 men to get it? Danny was halfway back to his car when he saw the man watching him from the tree line. The figure was maybe 60 yards away, partially hidden behind a cluster of pine trees. Tall, thin, wearing work clothes and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. When Danny raised his hand in a wave, the man stepped back deeper into the woods. "Hey," Danny called out. "You need something?" No response. The man melted back into the trees like he'd never been there. Danny's hand moved instinctively to his service weapon. In 15 years of law enforcement, he'd developed good instincts about when situations were about to turn dangerous. Something about the way the man had been watching, patient, careful, like someone with experience staying hidden, set off alarm bells. Danny walked quickly back to his patrol car, keeping his eyes on the tree line. As he got in and started the engine, his radio crackled. "Sheriff Morrison, you there?" "Go ahead." "Got a call from someone asking about your location. Said he was from the state mining office. Wanted to know if you were investigating old mine sites today." Danny felt his chest tighten. Did he give a name? "Said his name was Henderson, but when I asked for a callback number, he said he'd call back later," and hung up. Danny looked back toward the tree line where the man had been watching. No state mining inspector would be lurking in the woods at an abandoned mine site. And how had anyone known he was here? "Copy," Danny said. "I'm heading back to the office." But as he drove away from the Blackwater Mine, Danny couldn't shake the feeling that his visit had triggered something. Someone was watching the site, someone who didn't want law enforcement poking around 50-year-old accident scenes. Back at the sheriff's office, Danny spread the Blackwater Mine file across his desk and started making phone calls. His first call was to the West Virginia Department of Mining Safety. "I need to speak to someone about historical mine records," he told the receptionist. "Hold, please." After several transfers, Danny found himself talking to a records clerk named Betty Mason, who had been with the department for 30 years. "Blackwater Mine," she repeated when Danny explained what he was looking for. "That name sounds familiar, but I can't place it. What year did you say?" 1962. Explosion that killed 17 miners. Let me check our database." Danny heard typing in the background. "That's strange. I'm not finding any incident reports for a Blackwater mine in 1962. Are you sure about the name and date? Danny stared at the file spread across his desk. I'm holding the county sheriff's incident report right now. 17 miners killed in a methane explosion on April 23, 1962. Sir, I've been maintaining these records for 3 decades. We have documentation for every mine fatality in West Virginia going back to the 1920s. If 17 miners died in 1962, there would definitely be a state investigation file. But there isn't one. No, sir. According to our database, there was no mining incident involving multiple fatalities in Mingo County in 1962. Danny felt something cold crawl up his spine. What about Cumberland Coal Company? Do you have any records for them operating mines in the Matewan area? More typing. I show Cumberland Coal Company operating several mines in southern West Virginia in the 1960s, but this is odd. Their Matewan operation shows a closure date of April 22, 1962, one day before your reported incident. They closed the mine the day before the explosion? According to our records, yes. And, sir, the closure was listed as administrative. No reason given. Danny thanked Betty Mason and hung up, his mind racing. The state had no record of the explosion. Cumberland Coal had officially closed the mine the day before it happened, and someone was still watching the site 50 years later. He picked up the phone again and dialed his father's number. Dad, I need to ask you about Grandpa. His father was quiet for a moment. What about him? How did he really die? Another pause, longer this time. Danny, why are you asking about this now? Because I found a file that says he was killed in a mine explosion in 1962, along with 16 other men, but you always told me he died of a heart attack. His father's voice went very quiet. Where did you find this file? In the county records. Dad, what really happened to him? Son, there are some things that are better left buried. Your grandfather wouldn't want you digging into this. 17 men died, Dad. 17 families were lied to. If Grandpa was one of them. Danny, his father's voice was sharp now. Drop this. Trust me. Some stones are better left unturned. The line went dead. Danny stared at the phone, his father's warning echoing in his head. But as he looked at his grandfather's name on the victim list, at the uranium surveys in the evidence envelope, at the photos he'd taken of the hastily sealed mine entrance, he knew he couldn't let it go. 17 men had died. Their families had been paid off and told to stay quiet. And 50 years later, someone was still watching to make sure the truth stayed buried. Danny Morrison was about to find out why. Danny spent the rest of the afternoon trying to track down the families of the other 16 miners listed in the incident report. Most of the surnames were familiar, names he'd seen on mailboxes, heard at town council meetings, families whose descendants still lived in and around Matewan. But when he started making calls, he hit the same wall over and over again. Henderson family? Oh, they moved away years ago, right after old Bill died, I think. The Caldwells? Haven't seen any of them since I was a kid. Heard they went up north somewhere. Bobby Garrett's family? They used to live on Elm Street, but the house has been empty for decades. By 5 o'clock, Danny had made 23 phone calls and found exactly 0 living relatives of the Blackwater Mine victims. In a town where families went back generations, where people knew everyone's business going back 50 years, somehow all the families connected to the worst mining disaster in local history had simply vanished. That wasn't normal. That wasn't even possible. Danny locked the files in his desk and drove home, but he couldn't let it go. He lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where he could think without interruption. After a dinner he barely tasted, he sat on his back porch with a beer and his laptop, using the internet to search for traces of the missing families. What he found was disturbing. According to public records, 6 of the 17 families had sold their homes and moved out of state within 6 months of the mine incident. 3 more had relocated within West Virginia, but to counties far from Matewan. The remaining 8 families had simply disappeared from the records entirely. No forwarding addresses, no death certificates, no trace of what had happened to them. Danny had investigated enough missing persons cases to know that entire families didn't just vanish without leaving some kind of paper trail. People had social security numbers, tax records, medical files. Someone always knew something. But the families of the Blackwater Mine victims had been erased as thoroughly as if they'd never existed. His phone rang, interrupting his research. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Sheriff Morrison? That's right. My name is Carl Hutchins. I heard you've been asking questions about the old mine incident. Danny sat up straighter. Who told you that? Word travels fast in a small town, Sheriff. I was wondering if we could meet and talk. There are some things you should know before you dig too deep into this. What kind of things? The kind that got a lot of good people hurt back in 1962. The kind that could still get people hurt today. Danny felt his pulse quicken. Are you threatening me, Mr. Hutchins? No, sir. I'm trying to warn you. There's a difference. Where do you want to meet? You know the old diner on Route 119, about 10 miles north of town? I'll be there at 8 o'clock. Come alone, and don't tell anyone where you're going. The line went dead before Danny could respond. Danny stared at his phone, every instinct telling him this was a bad idea. Meeting unknown contacts in isolated locations was exactly the kind of thing that got law enforcement officers killed. But Carl Hutchins had information about the mine incident, and Danny needed answers more than he needed safety. He holstered his service weapon, grabbed his truck keys, and headed out into the mountain darkness. The diner on Route 119 had been closed for years, but the parking lot lights were still working, casting yellow pools of illumination across cracked asphalt. Danny arrived 15 minutes early and did a careful sweep of the area, looking for signs of an ambush or backup vehicles. The place appeared deserted, except for a single pickup truck parked near the diner's entrance. At exactly 8 o'clock, a man emerged from the shadows near the building. He was probably in his 70s, with white hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of outdoor work. He moved carefully, like someone whose joints had seen better days, but his eyes were sharp and alert. Sheriff Morrison? Mr. Hutchins. They shook hands, and Danny noticed the man's grip was still strong, despite his age. Thank you for coming, Hutchins said. I wasn't sure you would. You said you had information about the mine incident. Hutchins nodded toward a picnic table near the edge of the parking lot. Let's sit. This is going to take a while. They settled across from each other, and Hutchins pulled a thermos from his jacket pocket. Coffee? I'm good. Talk to me about 1962. Hutchins poured himself a cup and took a long sip before speaking. I was 22 years old then, worked at the mine for about 3 years, usually on the day shift. But on April 23rd, I called in sick. Danny felt his pulse quicken. You were supposed to be working the day of the explosion? Should have been down there with the rest of them. James Morrison was my shift supervisor. Good man, fair boss. If I hadn't had food poisoning that morning, I'd be dead too. So you believe the explosion really happened? Hutchins laughed bitterly. Sheriff, there was no explosion. The words hung in the night air like a physical thing. Danny leaned forward. What do you mean? I mean those 17 men didn't die in any methane blast. They were murdered, shot down in the tunnels like dogs, and then buried behind concrete and steel so nobody could ever find the bodies. Danny's mouth went dry. How do you know this? Because I saw it happen. Hutchins set down his coffee cup and looked Danny in the eye. I may have called in sick, but I couldn't sleep that morning. Felt guilty about leaving my crew short-handed. So around noon, I drove out to the mine to see if they needed me for the afternoon shift. He paused, his hands shaking slightly as he picked up the thermos again. When I got there, I heard gunshots coming from underground. Not 1 or 2 shots, a lot of them, like a war was happening down in those tunnels. What did you do? hid behind one of the equipment sheds and waited. About 20 minutes later, men started coming up from the mine. Not miners, men in suits carrying rifles. And behind them came more men in work clothes, but they weren't Cumberland Coal employees. I'd never seen any of them before. Danny pulled out his notebook. How many men? 8 or 10, maybe more. They spent the next 2 hours bringing up equipment, files, boxes of stuff, loading it all into trucks that weren't marked with any company names. Did you recognize anyone? Hutchins nodded grimly. Harold Vance, the Cumberland Coal site supervisor, and Sheriff Hawkins, both of them armed, both of them giving orders like they were running the show. Danny felt ice in his veins. The sheriff was involved? Up to his neck. I watched him personally supervise the concrete trucks when they came to seal the mine entrance. Must have been 6 or 7 loads of concrete, way more than you'd need just to close a shaft. Why didn't you report what you saw? Hutchins laughed, but there was no humor in it. To who? The sheriff's department? Harold Vance owned half the county commissioners. And sheriff, you have to understand, this was 1962. The Cold War was hot, the government had all kinds of black projects running, and people who asked too many questions had a way of disappearing. Danny studied the old man's face in the parking lot lights. But you're telling me now? Because I'm 73 years old, and I've been carrying this secret for 50 years. Because those 17 men had families who deserved to know the truth. And because, Hutchins hesitated, because what? Because they're still out there, Sheriff. The people who ordered those killings. Maybe not the same individuals, but the same organizations, the same interests. And if you keep digging into this, they're going to come for you the same way they came for anyone else who got too close to the truth. Danny leaned back, his mind reeling. Mr. Hutchins, if what you're telling me is true, we're talking about mass murder and a conspiracy involving local law enforcement and federal agencies. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Why should I believe you? Hutchins reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metal object, setting it on the picnic table between them. It was a brass shell casing, tarnished with age, but still clearly marked with caliber and manufacturer information. I picked this up outside the mine entrance that day, Hutchins said. Figured someday someone might need proof that those men were shot, not killed in any explosion. Danny picked up the shell casing, turning it over in his hands. It was .306 caliber, military issue, the kind of ammunition used in government-issued rifles. There's something else, Hutchins said, something that might help you understand why they were willing to kill 17 men to keep it secret. He pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellow with age. I managed to grab this from one of the boxes they were loading into the trucks. Geological survey report. Danny unfolded the paper and read by the light of his phone. The document was technical, full of mining terminology he didn't understand, but one section was circled in red ink. High-grade uranium ore. Concentration, 2.7% by weight. Estimated reserves, 47,000 tons. Current market value, $127 million. Danny whistled low. $127 million in 1962? Worth maybe 10 times that in today's money, Hutchins said. And Sheriff, that was just the uranium. There were other minerals down there too, rare earth elements that were even more valuable for weapons research. Danny folded the paper carefully and put it in his jacket pocket along with the shell casing. Mr. Hutchins, if you've had this evidence for 50 years, why didn't you ever? Because they killed anyone who tried. Hutchins' voice was flat. 3 months after the mine incident, Deputy Collins, the one who wanted to investigate further, died in a car accident on a straight stretch of road he'd driven 1,000 times. 6 months later, a newspaper reporter from Charleston who was asking questions about the mine died of a sudden heart attack at age 31. A year later, Harold Vance's own secretary disappeared completely after someone saw her photocopying company files. Danny felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. They've been killing people to cover this up for 50 years? anyone who got too close to the truth. Sheriff, I'm telling you this because those 17 men deserve justice. But I'm also telling you because if you're not careful, you're going to be number 18. As if summoned by Hutchins' words, headlights appeared on Route 119, moving slowly toward the diner. Both men watched as a dark sedan pulled into the parking lot and stopped about 50 yards away, its engine running but the driver staying inside. "Time for me to go," Hutchins said, standing up quickly. "Sheriff, be very careful who you trust. This conspiracy has roots in places you wouldn't expect." "Wait," Danny said. "How do I contact you if I need more information?" But Hutchins was already walking toward his truck. "You don't. After tonight, Carl Hutchins is going to disappear just like those 17 families did. It's the only way to stay alive." He got in his truck and drove off, leaving Danny alone in the parking lot with the dark sedan and a shell casing that proved 17 men had been murdered for a uranium deposit worth over $1 billion in today's money. The sedan's driver door opened and a man in a suit stepped out. Danny's hand moved to his service weapon as the man walked slowly across the parking lot toward him. "Sheriff Morrison," the man called out, "I think we need to talk." The man in the suit was younger than Danny had expected, maybe 45, with the kind of clean-cut appearance that screamed federal agent. He walked with the confident stride of someone who was used to being in control of situations, his hands visible but ready to move quickly if needed. "Agent James Crawford, FBI," he said, pulling out a badge wallet. "Mind if we have a conversation?" Danny kept his hand near his weapon. "Depends on what kind of conversation you have in mind." "The kind where I explain why poking around in 50-year-old mining accidents might not be in your best interest, or the best interest of your community." "Is that a threat, Agent Crawford?" Crawford smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's practical advice from someone who knows more about the Blackwater situation than you do." Danny studied the man's face in the parking lot lights. "How did you know I was here?" "We've been monitoring communications related to the Blackwater Mine since this morning. Your phone calls to the state mining office triggered some automated flags in our system." "Your system? What system would that be?" Crawford gestured toward the picnic table where Danny had been sitting with Hutchins. "Mind if we sit? This might take a few minutes." Against his better judgment, Danny nodded. They sat across from each other, and Crawford pulled out a manila folder from his jacket. "Sheriff Morrison, what I'm about to tell you is classified information that I'm sharing with you as a professional courtesy. The Blackwater Mine incident in 1962 was part of a federal operation related to national security interests during the Cold War." "What kind of operation?" Crawford opened the folder and showed Danny a document with heavy black redactions covering most of the text. "Uranium extraction for weapons development. The miners who died weren't victims of an industrial accident. They were casualties of a necessary operation to secure strategic materials for the defense of the United States." Danny felt anger building in his chest. "You're telling me the federal government murdered 17 miners?" "I'm telling you that during the Cold War, difficult decisions had to be made to protect national security. The uranium deposits at Blackwater were critical to our nuclear weapons program. When the miners discovered the true nature of what they were extracting, they became a security risk." "So you killed them?" Crawford's expression didn't change. "The operation was carried out by contractors working under federal authority. The miners were offered relocation packages to other parts of the country with new identities and financial compensation. Most accepted. Some didn't." Danny pulled out his notebook. "Carl Hutchins said he saw men with rifles coming up from the mine. He said he heard gunshots." Crawford closed the folder. "Carl Hutchins is a 73-year-old man whose memory of events from 50 years ago may not be entirely reliable. There were no gunshots, Sheriff. There was no mass murder. There was a controlled relocation of civilian personnel who had access to classified information." "Then why was my grandfather listed as dead in the county incident report?" Because James Morrison refused relocation. He insisted on staying in Matewan, continuing to work at the mine, potentially compromising the entire operation. He was given multiple opportunities to accept the relocation package. Crawford leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Your grandfather was a patriot, Sheriff?" But he was also stubborn. When he threatened to go public with information about the uranium extraction, difficult decisions had to be made. Danny felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "You killed my grandfather because he wouldn't keep quiet about a government mining operation?" "Your grandfather died in service to his country, just like soldiers who die in classified missions overseas. The difference is, we couldn't give him a medal or a military funeral without compromising national security." "Bullshit!" Danny stood up abruptly. "You murdered 17 miners and covered it up." Crawford remained seated, his voice calm. "Sheriff, I understand this is difficult information to process, but you need to understand the bigger picture here. The uranium extracted from Blackwater Mine was used to build nuclear weapons that helped end the Cold War and protect American lives for decades. By killing American citizens, by making hard choices in difficult times." Crawford stood up and closed his folder. "The same kinds of hard choices that are still being made today to protect national security." Danny felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Is that why you're here? To make sure I make the right choice?" "I'm here to offer you the same opportunity your grandfather was given. Walk away from this investigation and your family stays safe. Your career continues uninterrupted. Life goes on as normal." "And if I don't walk away?" Crawford smiled again, and this time there was something predatory in his expression. "Sheriff, you're investigating the deaths of 17 men who supposedly died 50 years ago. If something were to happen to you during that investigation, an accident at an abandoned mine site, maybe a structural collapse in an old tunnel, it would be a tragic but understandable occupational hazard." Danny's hand moved to his service weapon. "Now that definitely sounds like a threat." "It's a reality check," Crawford said. "The people who ordered the Blackwater operation are still alive, still in positions of power, still making decisions about national security. They've spent 50 years protecting this secret, and they're not going to let a small-town sheriff expose it now." Crawford walked back toward his sedan, then turned around. "You have 24 hours to decide, Sheriff. After that, the offer expires." "What offer?" "The offer to walk away and live a long, quiet life." Crawford got in his car and rolled down the window. "Oh, and Sheriff? Carl Hutchins won't be available for any more conversations. He's decided to take an extended vacation out of state. Permanently." The sedan pulled away, leaving Danny alone in the parking lot with a shell casing in his pocket and the terrible understanding that he was now a target in a conspiracy that had been killing people for 5 decades. He got in his truck and drove home, his mind racing. Crawford's story about voluntary relocation didn't match what Hutchins had told him about gunshots and bodies. But Crawford's threats were very real, and the implication that Hutchins had been eliminated or forced to disappear was terrifying. Back at his house, Danny sat at his kitchen table and spread out everything he'd learned. The county incident report with his grandfather's name, the geological survey showing uranium deposits worth billions the shell casing Hutchins had given him, and the photos he'd taken of the hastily sealed mine entrance. The evidence pointed to mass murder and a federal cover-up. But Crawford's warning made it clear that pursuing the truth could get Danny killed, just like it had gotten others killed over the past 50 years. Danny's phone rang, startling him. The caller ID showed his father's number. "Danny, are you all right?" "I'm fine, Dad. Why?" "Because I just had a visit from 2 men in suits who said you were investigating dangerous criminal activity related to the old mine. They wanted to know if you'd said anything to me about what you found." Danny felt his blood turn to ice. "What did you tell them?" "I told them you hadn't shared any details with me, which is true. But Danny, these men, they weren't local law enforcement. They knew things about our family, about your grandfather, that nobody should know. What kind of things? They knew about the heart attack story. They knew we'd never told you the truth about how your grandfather died. And son, they knew your mother's maiden name, where she went to school, where she worked before she married me. They knew details about our lives that felt like threats. Danny closed his eyes. The conspiracy wasn't just coming for him. They were putting pressure on his family to make sure he backed down. Dad, I need you and Mom to go visit Aunt Sarah in Charleston for a few days. Right now. Danny, what have you gotten yourself into? I found out what really happened to Grandpa, and now the people who killed him are threatening anyone who might help me expose the truth. His father was quiet for a long moment. Son, your grandfather tried to do the right thing 50 years ago. It got him killed. Don't make the same mistake. Maybe it's time someone finished what Grandpa started. Danny, please, think about your family. Think about the people in this town who depend on you. Is digging up 50-year-old secrets worth risking all of that? Danny looked at the evidence spread across his kitchen table, at his grandfather's name on the victim list, at the shell casing that proved 17 men had been murdered for uranium deposits. Yeah, Dad, I think it is. After hanging up, Danny made two decisions. First, he was going to find a way to get into the sealed Blackwater Mine and document what was really down there. Second, he was going to find out if any of the 17 miners had actually survived the 1962 incident and been forced into hiding like Carl Hutchins claimed. Because Agent Crawford had made one mistake during their conversation. He'd mentioned that some of the miners had accepted relocation packages and moved to other parts of the country with new identities. If that was true, then some of the Blackwater victims might still be alive. And if Danny could find them, he might be able to get the testimony he needed to expose 50 years of murder and cover-ups. But first, he had to make sure his parents got out of town before the federal agents decided they were liabilities that needed to be eliminated. Danny grabbed his keys and headed back out into the mountain darkness. He had less than 24 hours to decide whether to walk away or fight. And he'd already made his choice. Danny's first stop was his parents' house, a small brick ranch on the outskirts of town where he'd grown up. The porch light was on, and through the front window he could see his father sitting in his recliner, staring at the television without really watching it. His mother answered the door in her bathrobe, her face tight with worry. "Danny, what's going on? Your father won't tell me anything about those men who came by." "Mom, I need you and Dad to pack a bag and drive to Charleston tonight. Stay with Aunt Sarah for a few days." "Why? What's happening?" Danny's father appeared behind her, his expression grim. "Because our son has decided to poke a hornet's nest that's been quiet for 50 years. "James Morrison was my grandfather," Danny said. "I have a right to know how he really died." His father stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind him. "Danny, let me tell you something about your grandfather that I never wanted you to know. He was a good man, but he was also stubborn as a mule. When he got an idea in his head about right and wrong, nothing could change his mind." That sounds like something to be proud of. It is, but it's also what got him killed. His father's voice dropped to a whisper. "Your grandfather found something in that mine that he wasn't supposed to see. Government men came and told him to keep quiet, offered him money to relocate the family. He refused, said he had a responsibility to his community, to the other miners. So they murdered him. They made him disappear, along with anyone else who wouldn't take their money and keep their mouths shut." His father gripped Danny's shoulder. "Son, I was 10 years old when it happened. I watched my mother cry herself to sleep every night for 2 years after we were told he died in an explosion. I watched our neighbors pack up and leave town one by one until there was nobody left who remembered what really happened." Danny felt something cold settle in his chest. How many people knew the truth? Everybody knew something was wrong. You don't lose 17 men in an explosion and have it wrapped up in 3 weeks unless powerful people want it wrapped up. But nobody talked about it, because the families who asked too many questions ended up like the Hendersons. What happened to the Hendersons? His father was quiet for a long moment. Billy Henderson's widow refused to sign the settlement papers, said she wanted a real investigation into how her husband died. 3 months later, their house burned down in the middle of the night. Martha Henderson and her 2 kids died in the fire. Official cause was electrical problems, but everybody knew better. Danny felt sick. They killed a woman and her children? They killed anyone who threatened to expose the truth, and now you're threatening to do the same thing. His father looked toward the street where a sedan with tinted windows was parked under a streetlight. They're watching us right now, Danny. Those men who came by earlier, they're still here. Danny followed his father's gaze and saw the car. It hadn't been there when he arrived. All the more reason for you to get out of town tonight, Danny said. Drive to Charleston. Stay with Aunt Sarah. Don't tell anyone where you're going. His mother appeared in the doorway again. Danny, why can't you just let sleeping dogs lie? Your grandfather's been gone 50 years. Digging this up won't bring him back. But it might bring justice for 17 families who were lied to and threatened into silence. And it might get you killed, his father said. Is that what you want? Is that what your grandfather would want? Danny thought about the shell casing in his pocket, about Carl Hutchins' terrified face in the diner parking lot, about Agent Crawford's casual threats. His father was right. Pursuing this investigation could get him killed, but it could also expose a conspiracy that had been murdering innocent people for half a century. I'll be careful, Danny said. But I can't walk away from this. His father nodded slowly. I knew you'd say that. You're just like him, you know. Same stubborn streak, same sense of right and wrong. He sighed. We'll pack a bag and leave tonight. But Danny, if something happens to you, if you disappear like your grandfather did, I want you to know that we understand why you did it. Danny hugged both his parents, knowing it might be the last time he saw them. As he walked back to his truck, he noticed the sedan's engine start up. They were going to follow him, which meant his parents would be safe once he led the surveillance away from their house. Danny drove toward the center of town, taking a circuitous route that would give his parents time to pack and leave. The sedan stayed behind him, maintaining a professional distance, but making no effort to hide their presence. They wanted him to know he was being watched. At the sheriff's office, Danny parked under the lights and walked inside, knowing the surveillance team would have to decide whether to follow him into a law enforcement building or wait outside. They chose to wait. Danny went to his desk and opened the locked drawer where he'd stored the Blackwater Mine files. Everything was still there, but something felt different. The papers were stacked slightly differently than he'd left them, and there was a faint smell of cologne in the air that hadn't been there before. Someone had been through his desk. Danny gathered up the files and his laptop, then walked to the back exit of the building. His patrol car was parked in the rear lot, away from the street where the surveillance team was waiting. If he was lucky, he could get a few hours' head start before they realized he'd slipped away. But first, he needed to make a stop that might get him the breakthrough he needed. 20 minutes later, Danny pulled up in front of a small house on the edge of Matewan's industrial district. The address had taken him an hour of searching through property records, but he'd finally found what he was looking for, the current address of Ruth Morrison, his grandfather's sister. Aunt Ruth was 86 years old and lived alone in a house filled with 50 years of accumulated memories. She answered the door in a housecoat, her white hair in curlers, squinting at him through thick glasses. "Danny, what are you doing here at this hour?" "Aunt Ruth, I need to ask you about Grandpa James." Her expression changed immediately, wariness replacing confusion. "What about him?" "I found the real file about how he died. I know about the mine, about the uranium, about what really happened to those 17 men." Ruth Morrison looked past Danny toward the street, checking for surveillance, then pulled him inside and locked the door behind him. "You shouldn't be here," she said. "They're probably watching." "Who's watching?" "The same people who've been watching our family for 50 years. The same people who made sure nobody ever talked about what really happened at Blackwater." Ruth led him to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she worked. "Danny, there are things about your grandfather that your father doesn't know. Things I promised never to tell anyone." "What kind of things?" Ruth sat down across from him at the kitchen table. "Your grandfather didn't just refuse to take their money and keep quiet. He was documenting everything that happened at that mine. He had proof of the uranium extraction, proof of the government involvement, proof of the cover-up." Danny leaned forward. "What happened to the proof?" "He hid it, somewhere safe, somewhere he thought nobody would ever find it." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "The night before he died, he came here and gave me a key, said if anything happened to him, I should give it to someone who could use it to get justice for the other families." She stood up and walked to an old grandfather clock in the corner of the kitchen. Behind the pendulum, taped to the back panel, was a small brass key. "I've been carrying this secret for 50 years, Ruth said, handing Danny the key. "Waiting for someone in the family to be brave enough to finish what James started." Danny turned the key over in his hands. It was old and tarnished, with numbers etched into the metal. 247. "What does it open?" Ruth smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. "Your grandfather rented a safety deposit box at the First National Bank in Logan County under a false name. Everything he documented about Blackwater is in that box." Danny felt his pulse quicken. What name did he use? Patrick Morrison, his middle name and our maiden name. Ruth gripped his hand. "Danny, if what's in that box is as damaging as your grandfather believed, the people who killed him won't hesitate to kill you too." "I know. But Aunt Ruth, if I don't do this, they'll keep killing people to protect their secret. How many more Carl Hutchinses are going to disappear? How many more families are going to be threatened into silence?" Ruth nodded slowly. "Your grandfather would be proud of you and terrified for you." She walked to the window and peered through the curtains. "There's a car across the street that wasn't there when you arrived." Danny joined her at the window. A different sedan was parked under a streetlight, engine running. "They found me," he said, "which means they'll be watching the bank tomorrow." "Then you'll have to be smarter than they are," Ruth said, "the same way your grandfather was smarter than them for 50 years. Danny kissed his aunt on the cheek and headed for the back door. "If anyone asks, I was never here." "Danny," Ruth called after him, "be careful, and remember, your grandfather didn't die for nothing if you can finally get justice for those 17 families." Danny slipped out the back door and through Ruth's neighbor's yard, making his way to where he'd parked his patrol car 3 blocks away. The surveillance team would be watching the front of Ruth's house, waiting for him to leave the way he'd come in. As he drove toward Logan County and the First National Bank, Danny realized he was now carrying the key to evidence that could expose a 50-year government conspiracy involving mass murder and corporate cover-ups. But he was also being hunted by federal agents who had been killing witnesses for half a century. The race was on to see who would get to James Morrison's safety deposit box first, Danny or the people who had murdered his grandfather to keep him from opening it. The First National Bank in Logan County opened at 9 a.m., but Danny arrived at 7:30 to study the building and plan his approach. The surveillance sedan had followed him part way, but disappeared once he crossed county lines, which meant they either had other assets in place or they were confident they knew where he was going. Danny parked 2 blocks away and walked through the early morning mist that clung to the mountains around Logan. The bank was a small brick building from the 1960s, the kind of place where safety deposit boxes were accessed through a basement vault that probably hadn't been updated since his grandfather's time. At 8:45, Danny watched from across the street as 2 men in suits entered the bank. They weren't customers. Their posture and the way they scanned the interior screamed federal agents. Crawford's people had beaten him there. Danny's radio crackled. "Sheriff Morrison, this is dispatch. We've got a situation at the Blackwater Mine site. Someone called in suspicious activity, possible break-in." Danny keyed the mic. What kind of suspicious activity? Caller said they saw lights moving around inside the sealed entrance. Might be kids, but the property owner wants it checked out. Danny felt his stomach drop. The timing was too convenient. I'm in Logan County on official business. Send Deputy Williams to check it out. Williams is responding to a domestic disturbance. You want me to call the state police? Negative. I'll handle it when I get back. But Danny knew the call was fake. Crawford's people were trying to draw him away from the bank, back to the mine, where they could isolate him and eliminate the problem permanently, which meant whatever was in his grandfather's safety deposit box was dangerous enough to kill for. At exactly 9 a.m., Danny walked into the First National Bank. The two federal agents were standing near the customer service desk, showing badges to the bank manager. Danny couldn't hear their conversation, but he could see the manager nodding nervously and pointing toward the basement stairs. Danny approached the teller window with the key Ruth had given him. I need to access a safety deposit box, please. The young teller looked past Danny toward the federal agents, uncertainty crossing her face. Sir, I think you need to speak with Mr. Patterson, our manager. He's dealing with some kind of situation right now regarding the safety deposit boxes. What kind of situation? I'm not sure. Those men said something about a federal investigation into fraudulent accounts. Danny felt ice in his veins. Crawford's people were trying to seize his grandfather's box before he could access it. In a few minutes, 50 years of evidence would disappear into federal custody and never be seen again. Danny pulled out his sheriff's badge. This is related to an ongoing criminal investigation in Mingo County. I need immediate access to Box 247 under the name Patrick Morrison. The teller hesitated, looking between Danny's badge and the federal agents across the lobby. Let me get Mr. Patterson. There's no time for that, Danny said, raising his voice loud enough for the federal agents to hear. I have a valid court order requiring immediate access to that box. It was a lie, but it had the desired effect. Both agents turned toward the teller window, and Danny saw recognition flash across their faces. Sheriff Morrison, one of them called out, walking over with his hand resting casually on his jacket where a shoulder holster would be. Agent Crawford sent us to assist with your investigation. Funny, Danny said. Crawford told me to stay away from this investigation. Plans change. We're here to make sure you get the evidence you need safely. Danny studied the man's face. Everything about his posture screamed threat, not assistance. In that case, you won't mind if I access the box first and review the contents before sharing them with federal authorities. Actually, we do mind. National security protocols require federal oversight of any evidence related to the Blackwater incident. The bank manager approached nervously, a thin man in his 50s who clearly wanted to be anywhere else. Gentlemen, perhaps we could resolve this upstairs in my office? No, Danny said firmly. I'm accessing that box now as part of an active homicide investigation. He handed the key to the teller. Box 247, Patrick Morrison. I'll need a witness present during the opening. The federal agent stepped closer. Sheriff, I don't think you understand the situation here. That box contains classified materials that were illegally obtained by a civilian contractor 50 years ago. We're here to secure those materials for national security purposes. What I understand, Danny said loudly enough for everyone in the bank to hear, is that you're trying to suppress evidence in a mass murder case, and you're doing it in front of witnesses. The bank lobby had gone quiet. Other customers were staring, and Danny could see the teller reaching for what was probably a panic button under her counter. The federal agent's partner moved to Danny's left side, positioning himself to block any exit route. Sheriff Morrison, I think you should come with us. We need to discuss this situation privately. Danny's hand moved toward his service weapon. The only place I'm going is downstairs to open that safety deposit box, and if you try to stop me, I'll arrest you for interfering with a criminal investigation. On what authority? On the authority of the 17 families who were lied to about how their loved ones died. on the authority of a 50-year cover-up that's still claiming victims. Danny looked directly at the bank manager. "Mr. Patterson, are you going to let federal agents intimidate you into violating your customers' legal rights?" Patterson looked between Danny and the federal agents, clearly terrified. I think I need to call our legal department." "No time for that," the first federal agent said. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "It's done. Secure the building." Danny heard the front door of the bank lock electronically. Through the windows, he could see more agents taking positions outside. "Sheriff Morrison," the agent said, "you're under federal detention for interfering with a national security operation. You'll be released once we've secured the classified materials." "Bullshit," Danny said. "You have no legal authority to detain me." "We have all the authority we need." That's when Danny made a decision that would either save his life or end it. He drew his service weapon and pointed it at the federal agent. "Everyone on the ground now," he shouted. "This is Sheriff Morrison, and I'm placing these men under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." The bank erupted in chaos. Customers screamed and dropped to the floor. The teller hit the panic button, and the federal agents drew their weapons. "You're making a big mistake, Sheriff," one of the agents said, his gun trained on Danny's chest. "The mistake was made 50 years ago when you murdered my grandfather and 16 other innocent men," Danny replied. "Now we're going to find out what they died trying to protect." Danny backed toward the basement stairs, keeping his weapon aimed at the agents. "Mr. Patterson, you're coming with me. We're going to open that box, and you're going to witness everything we find." "Sheriff, I can't." "You can, and you will. Because in about 5 minutes, this story is going to be all over the news, and you're going to want to be on the right side of history." Danny reached the basement stairs and started backing down them, Patterson reluctantly following. Behind them, he could hear the federal agents coordinating on their radios, probably calling for backup and tactical support. In the basement vault, surrounded by hundreds of safety deposit boxes, Danny finally understood why his grandfather had been willing to die rather than let this secret stay buried. Because Box 247 was about to prove that the Blackwater Mine conspiracy wasn't just about uranium extraction and Cold War paranoia. It was about something much bigger, much more valuable, and much more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Danny inserted the key into Box 247 and turned it. The lock clicked open, and 50 years of secrets were about to see daylight for the first time since James Morrison had sealed them away. The safety deposit box was larger than Danny had expected and heavier. Patterson helped him carry it to the examination table in the center of the vault, both men's hands shaking as they set it down. From upstairs, Danny could hear the federal agents coordinating their response, their voices echoing down the stairwell. They were probably sealing the building and calling for tactical backup, but Danny had maybe 10 minutes before they decided to storm the basement vault. "Mr. Patterson," Danny said, "I need you to document everything we find in this box. Take photos with your phone, make notes, whatever you can do. If something happens to me, this evidence needs to get to the media." Patterson nodded nervously and pulled out his phone. Danny lifted the lid of the safety deposit box and felt his breath catch in his throat. The box was filled with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be geological samples wrapped in cloth bags. But on top of everything was a letter addressed to whoever finds this in his grandfather's handwriting. Danny unfolded the letter carefully and read aloud. "If you're reading this, it means I'm dead, and the people responsible for the Blackwater Mine murders are still covering up their crimes. My name is James Patrick Morrison, and I was the lead foreman at Blackwater Mine when 17 good men were killed on April 23, 1962. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but every word is documented in this box. The Blackwater Mine wasn't just extracting uranium for nuclear weapons. We found something else down there, something that the government and private contractors have been killing people to hide for 50 years. We found rare earth elements in concentrations that shouldn't exist in nature, elements that are essential for advanced electronics, satellite communications, and weapon systems that wouldn't be invented for decades. Someone knew those elements were there before we did. Danny looked up at Patterson, who was recording everything with his phone. "Keep going," Patterson whispered. Danny continued reading. On April 20th, 1962, 3 days before the murders, government scientists arrived at the mine with equipment I'd never seen before. They took core samples from the deepest tunnels and confirmed what they already suspected. The Blackwater Mine contained enough rare earth elements to supply the entire U.S. military for decades. But here's what they didn't expect. We miners had been talking to each other about the strange rocks we'd been finding. Some of us had taken samples home to show our families. A few had even taken samples to geology professors at the state university. When the government men realized we'd been collecting samples, they panicked. They couldn't let civilian scientists analyze elements that were supposedly secret for national security reasons. So they decided to eliminate all witnesses. Danny felt sick as he continued reading. They offered us relocation packages first. New identities, government jobs in other states, enough money to set up our families anywhere we wanted. Most of the men were tempted. It was more money than any of us had ever seen. But I knew something was wrong. If the government was willing to pay 17 families to disappear, whatever was in that mine was worth far more than they were telling us. So I started documenting everything. I hid core samples, photographed the mining equipment, copied geological surveys, and recorded conversations with the government scientists. Everything is in this box, along with proof that the methane explosion was actually a coordinated execution carried out by federal contractors. Danny's hands were shaking as he reached the final paragraph. "If you're my family reading this, know that I love you and I'm sorry for the pain my death will cause. But these 17 men have families too, and they deserve to know the truth. The Blackwater Mine contains enough rare earth elements to be worth over $10 billion in today's money. 17 good men died so that money could be stolen by people who were supposed to protect American citizens, not murder them. Use this evidence to get justice. Use it to expose the conspiracy. And use it to make sure no other families have to suffer what ours has suffered." James Patrick Morrison, April 22, 1962. Danny set down the letter and started going through the other contents of the box. There were dozens of photographs showing the mining operation, geological surveys documenting the rare earth deposits, and audio recordings on old magnetic tape reels. But what made Danny's blood run cold were the execution orders. Typed on official government letterhead, classified at the highest levels, were direct orders to eliminate civilian assets with knowledge of Project Blackwater and secure all physical evidence of rare earth extraction operations. The orders were signed by officials whose names Danny recognized from history books, people who had gone on to hold high positions in government and private industry for decades after the Blackwater murders. "Jesus Christ," Patterson whispered, looking at the documents over Danny's shoulder. "This goes all the way to the top." Danny picked up one of the cloth bags containing geological samples. Even 50 years later, he could see the unusual coloration and crystalline structure that marked these as something different from ordinary coal mining debris. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "You have 2 minutes to surrender the contents of that box, or we're coming down." Danny looked at Patterson. "Can you upload those photos to a cloud storage account right now?" "Already doing it," Patterson said, his fingers flying across his phone screen. "Sending everything to multiple email accounts and social media platforms." "Good man." Danny gathered up the most damaging documents, the execution orders, his grandfather's letter, and the geological surveys showing the true value of the rare earth deposits. He stuffed them inside his jacket just as heavy footsteps started coming down the basement stairs. "Sheriff Morrison," Agent Crawford's voice echoed through the vault. "This is your final warning. Surrender the classified materials and come upstairs peacefully." "Go to hell, Crawford," Danny called back. "This evidence is going public whether you kill me or not." "Actually, it's not." Crawford appeared at the bottom of the stairs with 4 tactical agents, all armed with automatic weapons. "Mr. Patterson has just discovered that his phone has no signal down here. Very convenient design feature for a bank vault. And his photos? They uploaded to servers that we control." Patterson looked at his phone in horror. The upload failed. None of it went through. Crawford smiled. "Sheriff Morrison, you're going to hand over every document, every photograph, and every sample in that box. Then you're going to forget this investigation ever happened." "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll join your grandfather in an unmarked grave, and the official record will show that Sheriff Danny Morrison died in a tragic mining accident while investigating reports of trespassers at the abandoned Blackwater Mine." Danny looked around the vault, calculating his options. 4 heavily armed federal agents, no backup, no way to communicate with the outside world, and evidence that could expose a 50-year conspiracy worth billions of dollars. But his grandfather had faced the same choice 50 years ago, and James Morrison had chosen to hide the evidence rather than let it be destroyed. Danny was about to make the same choice. "Crawford," he said, "before you kill me, answer one question. How many people have you murdered to protect this secret? Does it matter? National security requires difficult decisions. It matters to the families. It matters to the victims. And it's going to matter to the media when this story breaks." Crawford laughed. "What media?" "You're alone down here, Sheriff. No witnesses, no backup, no evidence that's going to survive the next 5 minutes." That's when Danny heard something that changed everything. Sirens, multiple vehicles, getting closer. Crawford's confidence flickered. "What did you do?" Danny smiled. "I called the state police before I came in, told them I was investigating federal agents who were interfering with a homicide investigation, gave them the address, and told them if they didn't hear from me in 30 minutes, they should assume I was in federal custody." It was a lie, but Crawford didn't know that. The sirens were getting louder, and Danny could see doubt creeping into the federal agents' faces. "You're bluffing," Crawford said. "Maybe. But are you willing to bet $10 billion worth of rare earth elements on it?" That's when the shooting started upstairs. The gunfire upstairs was brief but intense. Automatic weapons, handguns, and what sounded like shotgun blasts echoing through the bank's main floor. Then sudden, terrifying silence. Crawford pressed his radio earpiece, his face grim. "Report." Static. Then a voice. "Building secure. Local law enforcement neutralized. No media presence." Danny felt his stomach drop. The sirens hadn't been state police coming to rescue him. They'd been more federal agents arriving to contain the situation. "Disappointed, Sheriff?" Crawford asked. "Did you really think we'd operate for 50 years without learning how to handle local law enforcement interference?" Danny's mind raced. If Crawford's people had neutralized local law enforcement, that meant other cops were dead or wounded because of his investigation. The weight of that responsibility hit him like a physical blow. "How many?" Danny asked quietly. "How many what?" "How many cops did you kill?" Crawford shrugged. "Does it matter?" "They were casualties in a national security operation, just like you're about to be." Danny looked at Patterson, who had gone pale and was backing toward the far wall of the vault. The bank manager clearly understood that he was about to become another casualty in a conspiracy that had been claiming victims for half a century. "Mr. Patterson," Danny said, "I'm sorry you got involved in this." "So am I," Crawford said. "But witnesses are liabilities, and we don't leave liabilities behind." That's when Danny noticed something Crawford hadn't seen. Patterson's phone was still recording. The upload might have failed, but the local recording was still running, capturing everything Crawford had just said about killing law enforcement officers. Danny needed to buy time and get more evidence on that recording. "Crawford, before you kill us, satisfy my curiosity about something. How long has this operation been running? Just since 1962? Crawford checked his watch impatiently. "Sheriff, we don't have time for—" "Humor a dead man. The rare earth elements in Blackwater? When did the government first know they were there? Crawford smiled, apparently enjoying the opportunity to explain his organization's success. We've known about unusual mineral deposits in Appalachia since the 1940s. What we didn't know was exactly how valuable they would become for electronics and weapons systems. So you've been murdering miners for 80 years? We've been protecting strategic resources for 80 years. The Blackwater incident was just one operation in a much larger program. Danny felt sick. How many other mines? Dozens, across multiple states, whenever civilian miners discovered resources that were classified for national security purposes. We implemented containment protocols. Containment protocols? Is that what you call mass murder? Crawford's expression hardened. I call it protecting American interests against foreign adversaries who would use those resources against us. Danny looked around the vault, his eyes settling on the cloth bags containing his grandfather's geological samples. If Crawford was telling the truth about dozens of other operations, then the Blackwater conspiracy was just the tip of the iceberg. The families who disappeared, Danny said, the ones who took relocation packages. What really happened to them? Some of them accepted new identities and government jobs as promised. They're living comfortable lives under federal protection. And the ones who didn't accept? Crawford's silence was answer enough. Danny's radio crackled unexpectedly. Sheriff Morrison, this is Deputy Williams. I'm at the Blackwater Mine site investigating reports of suspicious activity. I found something you need to see immediately. Crawford grabbed for Danny's radio, but Danny was faster. He keyed the mic before Crawford could stop him. Williams, whatever you found, document it and get it to the state police immediately. Federal agents are trying to cover up a mass murder from 1962. Sheriff, what are you talking about? I'm looking at fresh excavation equipment here. Someone's been digging into the sealed mine entrance. Crawford went white. That's impossible. The site is under surveillance. But Danny understood what was happening. Williams, how fresh is the excavation? Looks like it happened within the last few hours. Sheriff, there's something else. I found an elderly man hiding in the woods near the mine. Says his name is Carl Hutchins, and he needs to talk to you immediately. Crawford's tactical team exchanged glances. Their surveillance hadn't been as complete as they'd thought. Williams, Danny said quickly before Crawford could stop him, Hutchins is a witness to the 1962 murders. He has evidence. Get him to safety and contact the FBI immediately. Sheriff, there's no need for... Crawford started to say. Not your FBI, Danny interrupted, still keying the radio. Contact the FBI field office in Charleston and tell them federal agents are impersonating law enforcement officers in Logan County. Tell them Sheriff Morrison is being held against his will by people claiming to be Agent Crawford's team. Crawford grabbed the radio and smashed it against the concrete wall. That was a mistake, Sheriff. Now we'll have to kill your deputy, too. But the damage was done. Williams had heard everything, and if Carl Hutchins was really alive and at the mine site, that meant the conspiracy had lost control of a key witness. Crawford pulled out his phone and made a call. We have a problem. The Hutchins asset wasn't neutralized as reported. He's at the mine site with a county deputy. Dispatch a cleanup team immediately. Danny's heart sank. More people were going to die because of his investigation. You know what the real tragedy is, Sheriff? Crawford said, putting away his phone. Your grandfather actually succeeded in hiding evidence that could have exposed this operation 50 years ago. If you'd just left it alone, those 17 families might have gotten justice eventually. But now, because of your interference, we'll have to expand the cover-up and eliminate additional witnesses. Including me. Including you. Including Mr. Patterson. Including your deputy. Including Mr. Hutchins. Crawford nodded to his tactical team. And, unfortunately, including your parents, who received classified information during your investigation. Danny's blood turned to ice. My parents don't know anything. They know enough. Federal agents visited them. They heard you discussing classified matters. They could become problems in the future. That's when Danny made a decision that would either save innocent lives or get everyone killed. He grabbed one of the geological sample bags from his grandfather's safety deposit box and threw it as hard as he could at the nearest light fixture. The vault plunged into darkness just as Danny dove behind a row of safety deposit boxes, pulling Patterson with him. Gunfire erupted in the confined space, muzzle flashes strobing like lightning as Crawford's tactical team tried to locate their targets in the dark. But Danny had one advantage. He knew exactly where the circuit breaker panel was located because he'd noticed it when they first entered the vault. In 15 seconds, he was going to find out if 50 years of planning and murder could be undone by a small-town sheriff with his grandfather's evidence and a whole lot of luck. The question was whether he'd live long enough to get that evidence to the outside world. Danny crawled through the darkness toward where he remembered seeing the circuit breaker panel, dragging Patterson behind him. The tactical team's flashlight beams cut through the vault like searchlights, and Danny could hear Crawford coordinating their movements in harsh whispers. Thermal imaging shows 2 heat signatures behind the east wall of boxes, one of the agents reported. Moving to flank. Danny reached the circuit panel and felt along the wall until his fingers found the metal box. He yanked it open and started flipping breakers, hoping to kill power to the entire building and maybe trigger some kind of alarm system. The vault went completely dark as even the emergency lighting died. "Building power is down," Crawford's voice echoed in the blackness. "Switch to night vision and end this." But Danny had bought himself maybe 30 seconds, and he used them to grab Patterson and move toward the vault's rear wall, where he'd noticed a service door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Behind them, he could hear the tactical team moving with military precision, their night vision equipment giving them a huge advantage in the darkness. Danny found the service door and tried the handle. Locked. "Patterson," he whispered, "do you have keys to this door?" "It leads to the old pneumatic tube system," Patterson whispered back. "We don't use it anymore, but it connects to the drive-through teller window." "Can we get through it?" "Maybe, but it's a tight fit." Danny could hear the tactical team getting closer. In a few seconds, they'd have clear shots at both of them. He pulled out his service weapon and fired 3 shots at the service door lock, the muzzle flashes temporarily blinding anyone with night vision equipment. The door sprang open, revealing a narrow maintenance corridor that smelled of dust and old grease. "Go," Danny hissed, pushing Patterson into the corridor ahead of him. They crawled through a space barely wide enough for their shoulders, following a path that Danny hoped led to some kind of exit. Behind them, he could hear Crawford's team breaking through the damaged service door. "They're in the pneumatic system," Crawford's voice echoed through the narrow corridor. "Seal all exits and flood the tubes with gas." Danny's heart sank. They were trapped in a confined space with armed federal agents behind them and poison gas ahead of them. But then Patterson grabbed his arm. "There," he whispered, pointing to a faint rectangle of light ahead of them. "The drive-through window." They crawled faster, Danny's knees scraping against the metal tube walls. Behind them, he could hear the hiss of gas being released into the system. Danny reached the drive-through window first and kicked out the pneumatic tube cover, sending it flying into the parking lot outside. Fresh air rushed into the corridor, and Danny hauled himself through the opening, then pulled Patterson out after him. They were outside the bank, but Danny could see federal agents positioned around the building perimeter. Crawford's team had the entire area locked down. "This way," Patterson gasped, pointing toward an alley that ran between the bank and the adjacent hardware store. "My car is parked behind the building." They ran for the alley, keeping low, but Danny knew they had maybe seconds before Crawford's people spotted them. He still had his grandfather's evidence stuffed inside his jacket, but it wouldn't do any good if they were both killed before they could get it to the media. That's when Danny heard the sound of helicopters approaching. But these weren't federal helicopters. As they got closer, Danny could see news station logos on their sides. "How the hell?" Patterson gasped. Danny's radio had been destroyed, but Patterson's phone had been recording everything Crawford said about killing law enforcement officers and covering up mass murder. Even though the upload had failed, the local recording was still intact, and apparently someone had been monitoring police communications. The first helicopter to land in the bank parking lot was from WCHS-TV in Charleston. A news crew jumped out and started filming everything: the federal agents, the sealed bank building, and Danny Morrison emerging from an alley with evidence of a 50-year conspiracy. "Sheriff Morrison," a reporter called out. "Channel 8 News. We received reports of federal agents shooting at local law enforcement. Can you comment?" Crawford appeared at the bank entrance, his face twisted with rage. But with news cameras rolling and helicopters circling overhead, he couldn't simply execute Danny and Patterson in broad daylight. "Those men are federal fugitives," Crawford shouted to the news crew. "They're in possession of stolen classified materials." "What classified materials?" the reporter shouted back. "What's this about a mining conspiracy?" Danny realized this was his chance. With live television cameras rolling, Crawford couldn't stop him from telling the truth. "My name is Sheriff Danny Morrison of Mingo County," he called out, pulling his grandfather's letter from his jacket. "I have evidence that federal agents murdered 17 coal miners in 1962 to cover up the theft of rare earth elements worth over $10 billion. The news crew surged forward, cameras focused on Danny as he held up the documents. "This letter was written by my grandfather, James Patrick Morrison, the night before he was murdered by federal contractors. It documents a conspiracy involving the illegal extraction of strategic minerals and the systematic elimination of civilian witnesses." Crawford was shouting into his radio, probably calling for backup or air support, but it was too late. The story was already going live on television. More helicopters were arriving, state police, additional news crews, and what looked like genuine FBI agents responding to reports of rogue federal operatives. Danny's phone, which he'd somehow managed to keep during the escape from the bank vault, suddenly rang. The caller ID showed Deputy Williams. "Sheriff, are you all right? I'm watching you on the news right now." "Williams, where are you?" "Still at the Blackwater Mine with Carl Hutchins. Sheriff, you need to know. We opened the sealed mine entrance. There are bodies down there. 17 bodies, still in their work clothes, all with gunshot wounds." Danny felt vindication and horror in equal measure. "Are you recording everything?" "Video, photos, everything. But Sheriff, there's something else. Hutchins says there are documents hidden in the mine that prove this conspiracy goes way beyond Blackwater. He says there are dozens of other sites, hundreds of other victims." Danny looked at Crawford, who was now surrounded by state police officers and reporters. The federal agent's career was over, but the conspiracy he represented was much larger than one operation. "Williams, secure that crime scene and don't let anyone near it except state police investigators. And get Hutchins somewhere safe. These people have been killing witnesses for 50 years. "Already done, Sheriff. State police are en route, and I've got Hutchins in protective custody." Danny hung up and turned to face the news cameras again. With the world watching, he was going to expose every detail of the Blackwater Mine conspiracy and challenge the federal government to explain 50 years of murder and cover-ups. But as he began reading his grandfather's letter aloud on live television, Danny knew this was just the beginning. Crawford had mentioned dozens of other mining operations, hundreds of other victims, and a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. The Blackwater Mine murders were about to become the thread that unraveled one of the longest-running cover-ups in American history. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., very powerful people were probably making decisions about how to contain the damage before it destroyed careers, corporations, and government agencies that had been built on 50 years of stolen resources and murdered witnesses. The question was whether Danny Morrison would live long enough to see justice for his grandfather and the 16 other men who had died trying to protect the truth. 6 months after the Blackwater Mine story broke, Danny Morrison stood at the entrance to what had once been a sealed tomb and was now the most extensively investigated crime scene in West Virginia history. The FBI had recovered the remains of 16 miners from the depths of the mine. His grandfather's body was never found, leading investigators to believe James Morrison had been buried elsewhere after his murder. Each victim showed evidence of execution-style gunshot wounds, exactly as Carl Hutchins had described, witnessing 50 years earlier. But the bodies were just the beginning of what they found. Hidden in a reinforced chamber deep within the mine were boxes of documents that James Morrison had secreted away before his death. Contracts between government agencies and private mining companies, lists of other containment operations across Appalachia, and geological surveys identifying billions of dollars worth of rare earth elements that had been extracted under the cover of national security. The paper trail led to mining operations in Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Tennessee, where similar accidents had eliminated civilian witnesses to classified extraction programs. In total, investigators identified over 300 miners and their family members who had been murdered or disappeared over 8 decades of covert resource operations. Danny walked through the mine's main tunnel, now lit with industrial lighting and swarming with forensic investigators, journalists, and congressional staff members preparing for hearings that would expose the full scope of the conspiracy. Carl Hutchins had become the star witness in what media outlets were calling the Blackwater hearings. His testimony about witnessing the 1962 murders had corroborated every detail in James Morrison's hidden documents, and his 50 years of careful observation had helped investigators identify other surviving witnesses who had been living in hiding across the country. Sheriff Morrison? Danny turned to see Congressman Michael Torres, chairman of the House committee investigating the mining conspiracy. Torres had flown in from Washington to personally examine the crime scene. "Congressman," Danny said, shaking the man's hand, "thank you for coming." "Thank you for having the courage to expose this," Torres replied. "Do you realize what you've uncovered here? This isn't just about mining operations. The rare earth elements stolen from sites like Blackwater have been the foundation of American electronics and weapons technology for decades. Cell phones, satellites, guided missiles, all of it built on resources that were literally stolen at gunpoint from American communities." Danny nodded grimly. "And paid for with American lives." They walked deeper into the mine, past evidence markers where investigators had found bullet casings, personal belongings, and the makeshift barricades the miners had built in their final desperate attempt to defend themselves. "What's the status of the prosecutions?" Danny asked. Torres's expression darkened. "Mixed results. Agent Crawford and his immediate team are facing federal murder charges, but some of the higher-level officials have claimed immunity based on national security classifications. We're fighting those claims in court, but it's going to be a long battle." "And the mining companies?" "That's where we're having more success. Cumberland Coal Company, which is now part of a major international corporation, is facing wrongful death lawsuits from the families of all 17 Blackwater victims. The rare earth elements extracted from this site alone are worth an estimated $12 billion in today's market. The families are going to be compensated, finally. Danny stopped at the spot where investigators believed his grandfather had made his final stand. Someone had left flowers there. Fresh daisies that looked like they'd been placed recently. "The other mining sites," Danny said. "How many families are we talking about?" "Over 800 confirmed victims across 6 states, Torres said, "and we're still identifying more as witnesses come forward. Some of these people have been living under assumed identities for 30 or 40 years, too terrified to contact their original families." Danny thought about the scope of the conspiracy. Decades of systematic murder, entire communities destroyed, families torn apart, all to steal natural resources that belong to the American people. "Congressman, what guarantees do we have that this won't happen again?" Torres pulled out a thick folder from his briefcase. "This is legislation we're introducing next month, the James Morrison Transparency Act. It will require congressional oversight of all federal resource extraction operations, mandate public disclosure of geological surveys on federal lands, and establish protection programs for civilian witnesses to government operations." "Named after my grandfather?" "Named after all of them," Torres said. "James Morrison, Carl Hutchins, and every person who had the courage to preserve evidence and tell the truth despite threats to their lives." They emerged from the mine into the afternoon sunlight, where Danny could see tourists and journalists still gathering to document the site where one of America's longest-running conspiracies had finally been exposed. His phone buzzed with a text message from his father. "Watching the congressional hearings on C-SPAN. Your grandfather would be proud." Danny smiled. His parents had returned from Charleston after Crawford's arrest, and the Federal Protection Program had relocated them to a secure location while the investigation continued. But the daily threats and surveillance were over. The conspiracy had been too thoroughly exposed to continue operating in the shadows. "Sheriff Morrison?" A young woman approached them, notebook in hand. "I'm Jennifer Walsh from the Washington Post. I'm working on a book about the Blackwater conspiracy. Could I ask you a few questions?" Danny had given hundreds of interviews over the past 6 months, but he still found it surreal that his grandfather's hidden evidence had become the basis for congressional investigations, federal prosecutions, and now books about government cover-ups. "What do you want to know? What made you decide to keep investigating even after federal agents threatened your life?" Danny thought about the question for a moment, looking back toward the mine entrance where 17 men had died trying to protect the truth. "I think about my grandfather's letter," he said. "The last thing he wrote was, 'Use this evidence to get justice. Use it to expose the conspiracy. And use it to make sure no other families have to suffer what ours has suffered.' That's not just advice, that's a responsibility that got passed down through 50 years of secrecy. And now those 17 families finally know the truth about how their loved ones died. Now the people responsible are facing justice, and now we have protections in place to make sure government agencies can't murder American citizens to steal their natural resources." Jennifer Walsh scribbled notes furiously. "Do you think justice has been served?" Danny considered the question. Crawford and his team were facing life sentences. The mining companies were paying billions in reparations. Congress was investigating the full scope of the conspiracy and implementing oversight reforms. But 17 men were still dead. Hundreds of other victims would never see justice. And some of the highest-level officials responsible for ordering the murders had escaped prosecution by claiming national security immunity. "Justice is being served," Danny said finally. "But it's not complete. It may never be complete. The best we can do is make sure the truth is known and prevent it from happening again." As the reporter walked away, Danny's radio crackled with a call from dispatch. "Sheriff Morrison, we've got a situation developing at the county courthouse. Large crowd gathering for the memorial service." Danny smiled. Today was the dedication of the James Morrison Memorial, honoring all 17 victims of the Blackwater Mine murders. Families from across the country were gathering to remember loved ones who had been missing for 50 years, finally able to mourn properly and celebrate their courage. "On my way," Danny replied. As he drove back toward Matewan, Danny reflected on everything that had changed since he'd found that file in the county archives. The town had become a pilgrimage site for people interested in government accountability and corporate transparency. Property values had increased as historians and journalists moved to the area to research the conspiracy. Most importantly, families that had been scattered and traumatized for decades were finally reconnecting and healing. At the courthouse, Danny found hundreds of people gathered around a simple granite memorial that listed the names of all 17 Blackwater victims. But what moved him most was seeing Carl Hutchins standing beside the memorial, no longer in hiding, finally able to honor the men he'd watched die 50 years ago. "Sheriff," Hutchins said as Danny approached, "thank you for finishing what your grandfather started. Thank you for preserving the evidence that made it possible." They stood together in silence for a moment, reading the names carved into the granite. James Patrick Morrison was listed first, identified as lead foreman and truth keeper. Danny's phone buzzed with another message, this one from a number he didn't recognize. "Sheriff Morrison, my name is Patricia Collins. My father was Deputy R. Collins, who tried to investigate the Blackwater murders in 1962. I have documents my father hid before he was killed in that car accident. I think you'll want to see them." Danny stared at the message, realizing that even 6 months after exposing the Blackwater conspiracy, there were still secrets waiting to be uncovered, still witnesses ready to come forward, still evidence hidden away by people who had refused to let the truth die with them. The fight for justice would continue. But today, 17 miners who had died trying to protect their community were finally being honored for their courage. And James Patrick Morrison's grandson was carrying on the family tradition of refusing to let powerful people bury the truth. Danny looked up at the memorial one more time, then walked toward his patrol car to respond to Patricia Collins's message. After 50 years, the Blackwater Mine conspiracy was over. But somewhere in America, there were probably other mines, other victims, and other secrets that needed a small-town sheriff with his grandfather's sense of justice to bring them into the light. Danny Morrison was ready for whatever came next.